My beloved child, don't skip. Listen carefully, because this is a completely fictional cinematic story about love, healing, courage, and the unexpected ways two lives can find each other again. It is not a prediction about your future or anyone else's. Stay until the very end, because every chapter uncovers another piece of a mystery that begins with a single handwritten letter and ends with a truth no one expected. It began on an ordinary autumn evening when the rain tapped softly against the windows of a quiet bookstore tucked away on a peaceful street. You had come there for the same reason you always did whenever life became overwhelming. The smell of old books, the gentle music playing in the background, and the silence between the shelves gave your heart a chance to breathe again. You never imagined that before the evening ended, an unexpected discovery would place you at the center of a story that had been quietly unfolding for years without your knowledge. Across the room, an elderly bookseller carefully organized a collection of donated journals that had recently arrived from the estate of a local author. Most visitors walked past them without a second glance, but one weathered journal seemed strangely out of place. Tucked inside its cover was a sealed envelope with only a few carefully written words on the front, to the one who was always meant to know the truth. You hesitated for a moment before picking it up. There was no address, no date, and no name. You assumed it had simply been forgotten years earlier. The bookseller noticed your curiosity and quietly explained that no one had ever claimed the journal despite months of searching. Believing it might contain personal memories rather than anything valuable, they gently encouraged you to take it home if you wished. You thanked them politely, slipped the journal into your bag, and continued browsing the shelves, never imagining that the faded pages hidden inside would soon reveal a story of regret, hope, and a promise someone had protected for far longer than anyone realized. At that very same moment, several miles away, another person sat alone beside a window watching the rain fall across the empty streets. Resting on their table was an old photograph and an engagement ring that had never been given to anyone. They whispered quietly that they had waited long enough and that the truth could no longer remain hidden. Don't skip this part, because everything changed the following morning. As sunlight filled your home, curiosity finally overcame hesitation. You opened the weathered journal expecting ordinary reflections, but instead discovered page after page describing the journey of someone who had spent years searching for the courage to tell the truth. The entries spoke about missed opportunities, painful misunderstandings, and a love that had quietly endured despite distance and time. Then, near the center of the journal, you found another sealed envelope. Unlike the first, this one contained a sentence that made your heart stop for a moment. The person who hopes to marry you believes you deserve the truth before you ever learn their name. You slowly unfolded the letter, completely unaware that the first line would lead you into a mystery that would change everything you believed about coincidence, forgiveness, and the extraordinary choices that shape an ordinary life. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter. Listen carefully, because this is still a completely fictional cinematic story about love, healing, and the courage to tell the truth after years of silence. The envelope rested quietly in your hands as morning sunlight spilled across the table. For several moments, you simply stared at it, wondering why someone would write such mysterious words without leaving a signature. Your heart wasn't racing because you believed in destiny or impossible coincidences. It was racing because every human heart recognizes the feeling of discovering something deeply personal that was never meant to be found by accident. Finally, with a slow breath, you unfolded the carefully written pages. The handwriting was elegant but unfamiliar, and the first sentence immediately captured your attention. It read, "If these words have finally reached you, then life has already begun correcting a mistake that fear allowed to grow for far too long." You continued reading, unaware that every paragraph would slowly uncover the story of someone whose greatest regret had never been losing love, but losing the courage to speak honestly when it mattered most. Don't skip this part, because the story inside the letter was unlike anything you expected. Instead of dramatic promises or emotional declarations, the writer described ordinary moments that had quietly changed an entire life. They wrote about seeing someone laugh inside a small bookstore during a rainy afternoon, watching them comfort a frightened child at a community event, and noticing how they always treated strangers with patience even when no one else was paying attention. Those small memories became far more valuable than grand romantic gestures because they revealed character instead of appearances. The writer admitted that they had admired those qualities from a distance, yet every opportunity to introduce themselves had been defeated by hesitation. They believed there would always be another chance, another conversation, another ordinary day. But life rarely guarantees tomorrow. By the time they finally gathered enough courage, circumstances had already taken both lives in different directions. Reading those words filled your heart with quiet compassion rather than curiosity. Whoever had written this letter clearly understood that the greatest opportunities are often lost not because people stop caring, but because they wait too long to tell the truth. Listen carefully, because while you continued reading those pages, another remarkable discovery was unfolding across the city. The person who had written the letter stood inside a modest jewelry workshop owned by an elderly craftsman whose family had created wedding rings for generations. Resting inside a small wooden box was a simple ring they had commissioned nearly 2 years earlier. It wasn't decorated with expensive diamonds or elaborate designs. Instead, it reflected something much more meaningful. Engraved inside the band were only 4 words, "Built on truth always." The craftsman gently smiled as he asked whether today was finally the day the ring would be collected. After a long silence, the writer quietly answered that they still weren't certain. They explained that the ring had never represented certainty about another person's answer. It represented a promise they had first needed to make to themselves, that if life ever offered another opportunity to love someone deeply, they would never again allow fear to speak louder than honesty. Leaving the workshop with the unopened box in their hands, they looked toward the bright morning sky and whispered that whatever happened next, the truth would finally be spoken. Stay until the very end, because the final page of the unsigned letter revealed a mystery that changed everything you thought you understood. As you reached the last paragraph, a small folded photograph slipped from between the pages and landed gently beside your coffee cup. You picked it up, expecting to see the unknown writer. Instead, the photograph showed a charity fundraiser held almost 3 years earlier. There were dozens of smiling volunteers gathered together, but your attention was immediately drawn to one unexpected detail. Standing in the background, only a few feet apart, were you and another person. Neither of you was looking toward the camera. Neither of you seemed aware the other was even there. On the back of the photograph, written in the same careful handwriting as the letter, were the words, "This was the first day I realized I wanted to spend the rest of my life with someone whose name I didn't even know." Beneath that sentence appeared one final line that left you completely speechless. It read, "Tomorrow, if courage doesn't fail me again, you'll finally discover who I am." My beloved child, don't skip this chapter. Listen carefully, because this is still a completely fictional cinematic story about hope, healing, and the extraordinary way ordinary choices can shape two lives. You spent the entire evening staring at the old photograph resting on your kitchen table. It seemed impossible that one forgotten picture could raise so many questions. You looked closely at every face, every smile, and every detail in the background, searching for something you had overlooked before. The charity event had taken place years earlier, yet until now you had never realized how many lives had briefly crossed paths that afternoon. Turning the photograph over once again, you reread the handwritten words. "This was the first day I realized I wanted to spend the rest of my life with someone whose name I didn't even know." The sentence felt strangely sincere because it wasn't written like a dramatic confession. It sounded like someone quietly describing the moment their life changed without anyone else noticing. For the first time since discovering the journal, you stopped wondering who the writer was and began wondering how many opportunities life quietly places before us while we are too distracted to recognize them. That simple thought remained with you long after the sun disappeared beyond the horizon. Don't skip this part, because while you searched for answers, the person who had written the letters was preparing to do something they had postponed for far too long. Early the next morning they returned to the quiet bookstore where the journal had first been discovered. The elderly bookseller recognized them immediately. A gentle smile appeared before either of them spoke because the bookseller had secretly hoped this day would finally arrive. The writer admitted they had spent years believing silence protected people from disappointment, but they had learned that silence often creates even greater regret. They explained that the journal had never been intended as a mystery. It had become one only because fear repeatedly convinced them to wait for the perfect moment. The bookseller listened patiently before opening a small wooden drawer beneath the counter. From inside, they removed another sealed envelope addressed in the same familiar handwriting. They quietly explained that the writer had left it there months earlier with one simple instruction. If anyone ever found the journal and genuinely wished to know the truth, the envelope should be given to them. The writer looked at it thoughtfully before saying that the time for hidden letters had finally come to an end. Today, the truth would no longer arrive through paper. It would arrive face to face. Listen carefully, because another unexpected clue was waiting where you least expected it. Later that afternoon, curiosity led you back to the bookstore. You hoped the elderly bookseller might know something about the mysterious journal or the person who had written it. As you entered, they welcomed you warmly, almost as though they had been expecting your visit. Without saying much, they handed you the final unopened envelope. Your hands trembled slightly as you carefully unfolded the single page inside. There was no confession, no dramatic declaration, and still no signature. Instead, there was only a simple invitation. It asked you to visit the community garden at sunset, the very place where the charity fundraiser had been held years earlier. Beneath the invitation was one final sentence: "You already know my story. Today I hope you'll finally know my name." You folded the page slowly, uncertain whether you should go. Every logical thought encouraged caution, yet something about the quiet honesty of every letter made you believe this meeting deserved a chance. It wasn't built on fantasy or impossible promises. It was built on months of reflection, courage, and a sincere desire to finally replace silence with truth. Stay until the very end, because as the sun began setting over the community garden, the mystery reached its most emotional moment yet. You walked through the familiar entrance, surrounded by flowers blooming in the warm evening light and families enjoying the peaceful surroundings. Everything looked ordinary, yet your heart quietly reminded you that ordinary places often become the setting for life's most unforgettable moments. Near the center of the garden stood someone holding a single white flower instead of an elaborate bouquet. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They simply waited with calm patience, carrying no expectations beyond the hope of finally introducing themselves honestly. As you stepped closer, they smiled with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years becoming the person they wished they had been from the beginning. Before they spoke, they reached into their pocket and carefully unfolded the old photograph one last time. Then, looking directly into your eyes, they softly said, "Before you learn my name, there's one truth you deserve to know. I never wanted you to fall in love with a mystery. I wanted you to know the real person standing before you." At that exact moment, someone unexpectedly called their name from across the garden, and for the very first time, you heard the name that had remained hidden throughout the entire journey. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter. Listen carefully, because this is still a completely fictional cinematic story about love, healing, courage, and the remarkable way truth can change two lives. The voice that called out across the community garden was calm, familiar, and completely unexpected. For a brief moment, everything around you seemed to disappear. Children continued laughing nearby, the evening breeze gently moved through the trees, and the golden sunlight reflected across the flowers, yet your attention remained fixed on the person standing before you. As they turned toward the voice, you heard their name spoken clearly for the first time. It wasn't the name itself that surprised you. It was the realization that you already knew who they were. Months earlier, you had met briefly during the community literacy fundraiser. You remembered the quiet volunteer who stayed long after everyone else had gone home, helping clean tables, stacking books, and making sure every family left with something to read. At the time, you had exchanged only a few polite words before life carried both of you in different directions. Neither of you imagined that one brief meeting would quietly become the beginning of a story still waiting to unfold. Don't skip this part, because the greatest surprise wasn't discovering their name. It was discovering the truth behind everything that had happened. They smiled gently before admitting that the journal, the letters, and every carefully written page had never been intended to create mystery or confusion. They had written everything during a season when fear convinced them they were too late to introduce themselves honestly. Every letter became another conversation they wished they had the courage to have in person. They explained that after seeing you volunteer with kindness and patience, they quietly admired not your appearance but your character. They noticed the way you encouraged nervous children, thanked every volunteer, and stayed behind to help without expecting recognition. Those ordinary moments remained in their memory because they revealed the kind of person you were when no one expected anything from you. Yet every opportunity to speak disappeared beneath hesitation. They convinced themselves there would always be another chance. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Eventually, all that remained were letters written to someone whose name they had finally learned but whose path they believed had disappeared forever. Looking into your eyes now, they admitted that carrying those words had become far heavier than speaking them honestly ever could have been. Listen carefully, because the conversation that followed changed both of your lives in ways neither of you expected. You thanked them for telling the truth, but you also admitted something equally important. During the months after your own difficult season of life, you had learned that genuine relationships cannot be built upon perfect timing alone. They are built upon honesty, patience, respect, and two people who are willing to keep growing. You explained that reading the journal had not convinced you to trust a stranger. Instead, it reminded you how much courage it takes for someone to admit fear, acknowledge mistakes, and choose vulnerability instead of silence. The two of you walked slowly through the garden as evening settled around you, sharing stories that should have been told long ago. There were moments of laughter, moments of quiet reflection, and moments when neither of you felt the need to speak at all. The mystery that had begun with hidden letters slowly disappeared, replaced by something much stronger. For the first time, there were no unanswered questions hiding between you. There was only honesty, and honesty brought a peace that neither of you had experienced before. Stay until the very end, because the most important decision had not yet been made. As the garden lights slowly illuminated the pathways, the two of you arrived at a quiet wooden bridge overlooking a peaceful pond. Your companion reached into their pocket one final time and removed the small wooden ring box they had carried for years. They smiled before placing it gently in your hands without opening it. They explained that inside was not a promise you needed to accept that evening. It was simply a symbol of the life they hoped to build one day. With someone who valued kindness more than perfection, honesty more than appearances, and faithfulness more than grand promises. They quietly admitted that whether your future together lasted a lifetime or only remained a meaningful friendship, they wanted this chapter to begin with complete truth instead of hidden feelings. Before you could answer, you looked toward the peaceful water and realized something unexpected. The greatest surprise had never been learning their name. The greatest surprise was discovering that the person who quietly hoped to marry you had first spent years becoming someone worthy of that hope. And as the stars slowly appeared above the garden, both of you understood that one final chapter remained, a chapter where the future would no longer be shaped by secrets, but by the choices two honest hearts would make together. My beloved child, don't skip this final chapter. Listen carefully, because this is still a completely fictional cinematic story about love, healing, forgiveness, and the quiet courage required to build a future together. The small wooden box rested gently in your hands as the evening breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers across the garden. Neither of you rushed to open it because, after everything that had happened, you both understood that the greatest gift was no longer hidden inside the box. It was the honesty standing between you. For so long, fear had written every chapter of this story. Fear had delayed conversations, buried feelings, and convinced two good people that silence was somehow safer than vulnerability. Yet standing together beneath a sky filled with stars, both of you realized that fear had finally lost its voice. In its place stood trust, patience, and a willingness to let the future unfold one honest step at a time. You slowly opened the box and found a simple silver ring engraved with 4 quiet words, "Always choose the truth." It wasn't a proposal asking for an immediate answer. It was a reminder that every lasting relationship begins not with perfect timing, but with truthful hearts willing to grow together through every season of life. Don't skip this part, because the greatest surprise of the entire story was still waiting to be revealed. You looked at the person beside you and asked the question that had quietly lived in your heart since reading the first letter. Why me? There was a long silence before they smiled with quiet sincerity. They explained that life had introduced them to many remarkable people, but very few possessed the quiet character that continues choosing kindness when no one is watching. They remembered seeing you comfort an elderly volunteer after everyone else had hurried home. They remembered how you celebrated another person's success without seeking attention for yourself. They remembered how every difficult situation seemed to reveal your patience rather than your pride. Those ordinary moments became extraordinary because they reflected the kind of life they hoped to build with someone one day. They admitted that they hadn't fallen in love with a fantasy or an idea. They had slowly grown to admire the person you consistently chose to become. Hearing those words, you realized something beautiful. The title of this story had never truly been about discovering a shocking name. The real surprise was discovering that someone had quietly valued your character long before they ever imagined sharing a future with you. Listen carefully, because every meaningful story reaches a moment where hope becomes stronger than uncertainty. The weeks that followed were not filled with dramatic promises or impossible fairy tale moments. Instead, they were filled with ordinary days that quietly became unforgettable. You shared long conversations over coffee, volunteered together at the same community center where your paths had first crossed, laughed over forgotten recipes that never turned out quite right, encouraged one another through difficult workdays, and slowly built something far stronger than excitement alone. Trust grew through consistency. Respect deepened through everyday kindness. Affection became stronger because neither of you felt the need to pretend to be someone else. Friends and family noticed that both of you smiled more often. The fears that once shaped every decision slowly disappeared, replaced by quiet confidence that whatever tomorrow brought, you would face it together with honesty instead of hiding behind silence. Both of you had learned that lasting love is never created by one extraordinary moment. It is built through thousands of ordinary moments where two people repeatedly choose patience, forgiveness, compassion, and truth. Stay until the very end, because this final lesson belongs to every heart willing to listen. 1 year later, you returned together to the same bookstore where everything had begun. The elderly bookseller smiled warmly as they watched the two of you walk through the familiar doorway. Sitting quietly on the same wooden table where the forgotten journal had once rested was a brand new notebook waiting to be filled. This time, the first page wasn't written by someone carrying regret. It was written by two people beginning a new chapter together. The opening sentence simply read, "The future is never changed by perfect circumstances. It is changed by ordinary people who choose truth, kindness, and courage every single day." You both smiled as you signed your names beneath those words, not because every question about the future had already been answered, but because you had discovered something even more valuable. A beautiful future is never built upon secrets or fear. It is built one honest choice at a time. As the morning sunlight filled the bookstore once again, both of you stepped outside hand in hand, grateful not for a perfect ending, but for a genuine new beginning. And that, my beloved child, is where this fictional story comes to its peaceful close, reminding us that the greatest surprise in life is often not the name we discover, but the character we choose to become before love finally finds its way home.